In the history of technology, Apple has always been the company that sets the rules, removing the floppy disk, the headphone jack, the home button, and the rest of the world quietly followed. But in 2023, for the first time in its history, Apple was forced to give in. The iPhone 15 arrived with a completely new charging port. Not because Apple wanted to, but because it no longer had another choice. A law from Europe achieved something that millions of Android users had dreamed about for over a decade, forcing Apple to abandon the Lightning port and switch to USB-C. That battle lasted 13 years, filled with loopholes, resistance, and failed negotiations. So how exactly did the European Union make it happen? Today, join Mido Discovery as we explore that story. Let's get started. To understand why the European Union was able to do this, we need to go back to 2009, when the tech world looked very different from today. Back then, Android phones used micro USB, Apple used its 30-pin connector, and laptop brands all had their own different round charging ports. Samsung had one type of cable, Nokia had another, and Sony used something completely different. Want to charge all your devices while traveling? You needed at least 3 or 4 different cables, and buying the wrong one was completely normal. Some families even owned 5 or 6 different chargers just to support all the devices in the house. At the time, charger and cable waste had already reached 11,000 tons every year in Europe alone. And with more than 500 million phones circulating in the EU market, this was clearly no longer a small problem. The European Union looked at that situation and decided there needed to be one common standard. But what standard would that be? The answer was USB-C, the small oval-shaped port you now see on most devices today. Unlike older ports, USB-C can be plugged in from either side, while also handling charging, data transfer, and video output all through a single connector. More importantly, USB-C is an open standard. It does not belong to any one company, meaning anyone can manufacture cables without needing permission. That was exactly why the EU chose it. And it was also exactly why Apple did not want to switch. So what exactly happened during those 13 years? It's not like the European Union didn't try. Back in 2009, they sat down with 14 of the world's biggest tech companies, including Apple, Samsung, and Nokia, and signed a voluntary agreement asking everyone to use the same micro USB standard. At first, it sounded like a good solution, until Apple found a loophole. In 2012, the iPhone 5 launched with the completely new Lightning port. Instead of following the agreement, Apple sold a small adapter that allowed micro USB cables to connect to Lightning, for around $19, of course, sold separately. Technically, Apple wasn't breaking any rules at all. They were simply following the agreement in the most literal way possible. The result? A 2014 survey showed that 99% of smartphones in the EU market were complying with the agreement. But that number was only true because Apple was counted as compliant thanks to a separately sold adapter. In reality, the EU had been outplayed right in front of its own eyes. In 2016, the EU tried again with a new agreement, this time pushing companies to move directly to USB-C. Every major company agreed, except Apple. They supported USB-C on the charging brick side, but strongly opposed changing the port on the actual device itself. After being outmaneuvered twice, the EU learned an expensive lesson. Voluntary agreements were basically just empty promises. If they wanted real change, there was only one path left: mandatory law. In 2022, the European Union decided to stop negotiating. Instead, they brought the issue directly to Parliament for a vote, and the result was overwhelming. 602 votes in favor, only 13 against. Almost unanimous. The law that passed was called the Radio Equipment Directive. It required all phones, tablets, cameras, headphones, and many other electronic devices sold in the EU to use USB-C, with no exceptions. But why did the EU even have the authority to do this? The answer is simpler than you might think. The European Union is a unified market with nearly 450 million people. Any company that wants to sell products there must follow EU laws, just like a car must meet emission standards before it can legally drive on European roads. That's not some special kind of power. It's simply normal market sovereignty. Apple could have refused, but refusing would also mean no longer being allowed to sell iPhones in the European Union, and that was simply too high a price to pay. So why didn't Apple simply refuse, accept losing the European market, and continue selling Lightning iPhones in the rest of the world? Because the numbers simply didn't allow it. By the end of 2024, Apple held 31% of the smartphone market in Europe, even surpassing Samsung to become the best-selling brand in the region. And while the EU only represented around 7% of Apple's global revenue, for a trillion-dollar company, that still meant tens of billions of dollars every year. No CEO is confident enough to walk away from a market like that. But there was another reason that people rarely talk about. If Apple sold Lightning iPhones in the rest of the world while selling USB-C iPhones only in Europe, the company would need to maintain two separate production lines at the same time. That cost would be even more expensive than simply switching the entire global iPhone lineup to USB-C. In other words, refusing the EU was never really a practical option, either financially or operationally. But for Apple, switching to USB-C was never just about replacing a port. They were giving up an entire money-making ecosystem built over more than a decade. What many people don't realize is that every Lightning cable sold on the market, whether made by Apple or a third-party company, had to pay licensing fees to Apple through the MFI program, short for Made for iPhone. Estimates ranged from 2 to 10% on every product sold. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of accessories every year, and it became a massive stream of revenue flowing back to Cupertino that most users never even noticed. That system worked because inside every officially licensed Lightning connector was a tiny authentication chip. Without that chip, the iPhone would refuse to properly recognize the accessory and display warning messages instead. That's why cheap, unlicensed Lightning cables often had problems, and also why official accessories were usually much more expensive than generic alternatives on the market. USB-C is an open standard. No authentication chip, no licensing fees, no need to ask Apple for permission. However, Apple didn't completely let go of control. Even after switching to USB-C, the company still requires MFI certification for accessories that use certain Apple-specific features, using a system similar to the authentication chips found in Lightning products. The game changed, but Apple is still trying to maintain some level of control. And that is the real reason Apple fought this transition for so many years. Not because of technical concerns, but because of money. There's one interesting detail that many people overlook. Apple didn't switch to USB-C only for iPhones sold in Europe. They switched the entire global iPhone lineup to USB-C, including markets with no charging port regulations at all. That means the iPhone 15 in your hands, whether you're in China, the United States, or almost anywhere else in the world, is using USB-C partly because of a law passed in Europe. This phenomenon actually has its own name, the Brussels effect. When the EU market is large enough, Companies often choose to apply EU standards to all of their global products instead of manufacturing two separate versions, simply because it's much cheaper and far easier to do that. The Brussels effect doesn't only apply to USB-C. Data privacy rules like GDPR, vehicle emission standards, and even food regulations have all spread beyond Europe in similar ways. In other words, the European Union doesn't need to dominate the world in order to change the world. It simply needs to be large enough that no company wants to be locked out of its market. Starting on December 28, 2024, the USB-C regulation officially took effect across the European Union. Phones, tablets, cameras, headphones, speakers, and many other electronic devices all now have to use the same charging port. A battle that lasted 13 years through 2 failed voluntary agreements, countless clever loopholes, and finally an almost unanimous vote, ended with something many people once thought was impossible. Apple gave in. But the real question is not who won or lost. The real question is this: could the EU accidentally be freezing technology at USB-C while the world continues to evolve? What happens when an even better connector standard appears, but lawmakers are too slow to keep up with innovation? The EU has promised to review the law if technology changes significantly. But the last 13 years have already shown that the gap between intention and action is never short. The next time you plug a USB-C cable into an iPhone, you're touching the result of more than a decade of negotiations, loopholes, and market power. It may be a small connector, but the story behind it is anything but small.